Good day, good people. This is Dr. Jamie Marich, and I am here for this very special interview with somebody I consider a dear friend, Dr. Paul Miller, who is joining us from
From Northern Ireland.
wonderful. So, Paul and I have had a lot of more technical interview conversations here on social media over the years, yet today's topic does get into the more personal arena. And I'm very honored that Paul asked me to be the one to facilitate this conversation. So I met Paul sometime in the late 20 teens. It was after your book, EMDR Therapy for Schizophrenia and Other Psychoses, came out. Thought it was brilliant, especially the Wizard of Oz metaphor, especially the way you handled dissociation. And I got to know Paul in a way that was very different than a lot of the stories I would eventually hear about Paul. And I know I'm not the only one who's had that experience, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fair point.
Yeah. So the question I get asked a lot when people find out that we're friends, Paul, is, but I heard Dr. Paul Miller is involved with sexual orientation change efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And my simple answer to that is I believe it was something he was in the past, but has not been for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
So, to set the record straight, Paul, I'm just going to ask you
Uh,
what people ask me. Are you involved in work with psychiatry, EMDR, and sexual orientation change efforts?
well, the short answer to that's very easy, and the answer is no. So I guess the well, we were using the language before. A previous version of me was, and so in a broad sense, um, uh, what nearly 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now, that was part of my own lived experience and part of my professional journey. I think I never really took on some of the labels in a sense of, I never saw myself as a conversion therapist or a reparative therapist or any of those sorts of epithets, but I always saw myself working with individuals within a sense of a trauma lens and helping people. Now, over the years, over that sort of 20-year journey from then, really, certainly very intentionally from 2010, I was very clear about my position on that, that I no longer supported it. But I think hopefully from our interview, people will see that part of this is also a journey of my own personal discovery, but wrestling with my past and past trauma, but also myself as a product of my generation.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk
And
about that. Tell me
yeah,
about the container in which you grew up.
oh man, it's very interesting. I mean, I think what's helpful for people to understand. So I was born in 1971, and Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom, and it's been traditionally very orthodox from a spiritual point of view, a faith point of view. People often, maybe if they know anything about Northern Ireland, know of conflict between Protestants and Roman Catholics.
Right.
But it was really that reflects really a tribalism. Many people with those labels of belonging to one faith tradition or the other had very little to do with faith, but those are the labels. And the old joke that used to be told was, a Jewish kid's walking down the street and the paramilitaries jump out in front of him and say, "Are you a Protestant or a Catholic?"
Mm.
He says, "Well, I'm Jewish." He says, he scratches his head and he says, "Well, are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic Jew?"
Oh, dear. Wow.
And it was just those sorts of labels. But
Right.
what you got to bear in mind when I was growing up, if you had the wrong label in the wrong place, you could be killed
Yeah.
or seriously injured. There was a lot of violence growing up. If we were going anywhere, my father would have left very early because you could be stopped at checkpoints or there could be a bomb and you could be diverted. So that was normal. That was just growing up. And as a kid, you don't have anything else to sort of put it by. So it was a violent environment growing up where there was real people lost their lives. People we're a very small society. I think is also important. Maybe about less at that stage, less than 1.5 million.
Hmm.
So when you consider that across what we generally call the Troubles, over 3,000 people were injured, and same again or more killed during that period of time. So it was quite a high percentage when you had a very small population. So you're growing up in a situation where everybody knew everybody. If you did something wrong, the risk of somebody knowing that you did something wrong and talking to your parents was like really high.
Hmm.
So, the sorts of growing up was in a sense something that was done very much in community where everybody felt you were watched. But in terms of LGBT or homosexuality, being gay was just never acceptable. It was something which you could be. I mean, the way I put it to people in our conversations before, you could be a terrorist who became a born again Christian, and you would be praised, and you could have taken life, you could have been involved in terrorism, and you would have been wheeled around to the local gospel halls as a wonderful example of God's transforming grace. But you couldn't be gay.
Right.
I mean, that was just horrendous. What you got to bear in mind in other parts of the United Kingdom, so in England and Wales, who have the same legal system, um, homosexuality was decriminalised, I think, if I remember correctly, somewhere around 1967. The same date for Northern Ireland was 1987.
Wow.
But even then, it was just not acceptable. And there's younger friends of mine who are now in their 30s, and like they still remember uh, a gay guy in their village being just openly abused verbally and physically sometimes, and that being just seen as acceptable. So, although it was decriminalized in 87, the society itself, has taken a very long journey
Hmm.
to be comfortable with that.
Hmm.
And so growing up at that stage, for me, that's part of the context. And I grew up
Right.
in a traditional, what Americans would refer to as Episcopalian or Anglican background. And then I went to a sort of a Christian youth organization. So again, there was, in all of those environments, there was no environment where being gay or being attracted to other guys or asking the questions about that would ever have been deemed to be acceptable. So it was a very antagonistic sort of environment. So um, I guess a big part of understanding my background around that is it. If we come back to the place of where did I feel safe,
Mm.
and so it wasn't really safe to
Hmm.
explore those things. I mean, I'll put it this way: I'm an identical twin,
Hmm.
and we're very close. But like, it wasn't something that we would have even discussed with each other.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, it was something that was the message at every level was this is completely unacceptable to even entertain.
Right. So, what drew you to psychiatry? And at what point did you become a psychiatrist?
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting question, I guess. I think, well, the first thing is, as a young boy, my mum trained as a psychiatric nurse.
Hmm.
One of my earliest memories is mum taking us to the hospital to pick up her rota. And the way adults sometimes they be children are there, but it's almost like they're invisible, and children
Hmm.
don't. They've got a bubble around them, so they don't hear anything that the adults do or whatever. We're not considered in that way. And I remember mum having a conversation with the nurse who was on duty, and they were talking about a patient who had absconded from the ward and then eaten fragments of a broken bottle at the door. And I remember just looking at my twin and saying, like, what's that about? Why would somebody do that? That's really weird. And so I think with mum training in mental health nursing, that sort of sowed a bit of a seed. But also I think then I really enjoyed the training at an undergraduate level in mental health. It fascinated me in a sense that it wasn't so definitive. It was an area of practice where we were still saying, well, I don't know how that works, or we have theories about that. Whereas a lot of the other physical and surgical specialties seemed quite definitive. It's this, and you do it that way, and so it didn't feel like that. And that unknowingness of it was really something which attracted me. And I think I've always been drawn to the liminal. And I
Mm,
think now looking back on it, part of that was in some way, in a sense, to try and understand myself
mhm,
and how did I fit in. And I had I was conscious of, although I wouldn't have had the words at that stage, I was conscious of having had uh, what I increasingly recognized to be quite a traumatic upbringing. So we had the trauma of the troubles, and like losing, there was a guy I played in a band with who was murdered, and his body was used as a booby trap then to kill two police officers. And that was just part of growing up, what I experienced. And but those things, they stay with you, and you eventually, as you're growing up, you start to want to find answers within the family. Then from someone outside the family, an older boy, I had some lived experience of childhood sexual abuse. And again, there was parts of that that really didn't make sense to me, but again, it was something that I felt I couldn't talk about either at that stage. So there was no sense of disclosure or anything like that. But that was a part of understanding myself. And then uh, my twin and I, we had an older sister, Margaret, who was 7 years older than us, and
mm,
she was great, energetic. I really loved her, and but
mm,
she got pregnant with her partner, who was a motorbike cop,
mm,
and sadly, she died coming back from her honeymoon, pregnant.
mm.
So it was a real tragedy, and that really family in a sense. And the year after that, my mother then left, and so the sort of breakdown in the family, and that was quite unusual in a sense, coming from a broken home, as it was called back then.
Right.
And it was so there was a sort of stigma around that, and we had some really tough times. And
Mhm,
my it's interesting because in a sense, my father, who I'm very close to, and in some ways we grew up almost like three brothers.
mhm.
And actually, his mother then really became a mother to me. So it was a very different dynamic than what I became aware of for other people growing up. Um, but like in a sense, part of it was just growing up. But as I became more self-aware, it started to lead me to understanding and asking questions. And so
Right.
being in a place as a young boy where I didn't understand everything that was, if you think of it this way, everything that for most people is a sound foundation growing up. So your siblings, your environment, your parents, your sort of nuclear family, those are things that I saw other people could depend on. But like for me, those things were just like sort of pulled away.
Right.
And so I think as a consequence, then my sister had a very strong faith, and we grew up in a churched family within the Anglican tradition. And so God became very important. And in a sense, for me, the thing about God was God's faithfulness and God's unchangeable love.
Mhm.
And that was a really secure thing. And so that I found that really helpful. But again, there's still, I think the God I met then was
Mm.
still very much, a divine accountant who was balancing the books
Right.
for
I know
sin.
that God.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think lots of people do. So there was a sense of, I think I grew up whenever, what's the best way to explain it? I think when you think about somebody who, you're hearing in church and you're hearing in scripture and you're hearing just in society, a mother a mother's love is this like unshakable paradigm. And uh and but, but whereas I had a mother who had walked away,
Right.
and so that for me was, I think, that inner child part of me had a sense of not being good enough.
Yeah.
Was that a part of it? I wasn't enough for her to stay.
Right.
And so I think that because of that, certainly God, as initially the God I met was the God as Father, and then the manifestation of Jesus as the Christ and of his physical incarnation. And we were important enough as humanity to incarnate. So that all of that was really important to me in the sense of Holy Spirit indwelling, but there was still this very much sense of the divine bean counter, can I offset your sin?
Mhm.
And but you've got that really big sin.
Mhm.
And so I think there was a part of me that was very driven to be like, I learned very quickly to be in the company of adults, and to when you have a core sense of not being enough, and I wouldn't have had the language for it at that time,
Right.
but you find ways to be enough.
Yes.
You
I
find ways to
relate.
be absolutely. And so like my twin and I, we sang in choirs, and we were, we were the twins, and we did a lot of stuff, and we excelled, and there was a natural competitiveness between us as well, but we always were very close. But so there was a sort of sense of, I think, also as a twin, reaching a point where you want to be seen as you. Like,
Right.
I love my twin and we get on really well, but there's also a sense of, I am not him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm me, and I am a person in my own right. And so I think then, growing up, I had an experience of, whenever we went to um, grammar school then at 11. So my sister had just died when we were 11. So we were a bit late starting the year, but we had already chosen, we'd come up school together, and we'd already chosen going to grammar school. We would choose
Mm-hmm.
um, different sort of classes so we could get to know our own sort of circle of friends. And so I had some friends at that stage, but then at that sort of, what age would have been, 11, 12, so maybe 14, 15, the group of people that I'd been friendly with, sort of,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I was rejected by them, I guess. There was a distance. And so when we moved to the senior school, because of the topics that I chose, I ended up sort of going into the same classes as my twin again. So I think with that, I always carried a bit of a wound about, can I choose my own friends and be successful with them? And there was a wound of rejection. So again, it was another loss to some degree that I was conscious of. So being accepted, being um, managing and curating your life, that you sort of, you don't want to do anything that makes you unpopular, or, I mean, like, it was, it was pre-internet and stuff, so like people could do something stupid and a few people knew about it, as opposed to like millions of people. So,
Right.
but it was still a big thing, and that's what I often say to people when I'm teaching about trauma. And I love Katie O'Shea's language of trauma as any threat for which the mind is not adequately prepared. And why is bullying so traumatic? It's that sense of othering. It's that sense. So there's a lot of stuff, I think, about, you I learned how to fit in. I guess I could have been a bit of a chameleon in that regards. I knew what would keep me safe, and
Okay.
you absolutely knew what not to even discuss.
Right.
Um, and so things like the past history of sexual abuse, I never would have even thought about bringing it up.
Right.
And so I think that sense of, wanting to be, well, I guess the right word is orthodox, because in a sense, God was a very orthodox God at that stage, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense of you had to, there were certain things you had to do, and there were certain things that were acceptable. And you got to remember, when I was growing up, we still had a situation. We were in an all boys youth club,
Right.
and then called the Crusaders. It was a great movement, and really enjoyed it. Learned a lot from that. Great leaders. And then at the same time, there was an all girls version, and just to give people an idea of the sort of culture that was still happening at that stage, the girls, if they became a leader, they had to agree not to go to the cinema. So like going to the
Wow.
cinema was still
Yeah.
that was a bit,
Would
questionable.
take you into the near occasion of sin.
Oh, absolutely. It's practically smoking on the threshold
Right.
of the door. And so there's all that sort of stuff. There's very much a sense of what was allowed and what was
Mm-hmm.
not allowed. And so I think for some of that, ultimately, I built a version of me that
Sure.
was able to keep myself safe by fitting in, I guess.
I get that. I relate to that. I think that's one of the reasons you and I have connected, is growing up in the kind of religious containers I did, both
Yeah.
Catholic and Protestant.
Hmm.
They were both still very high demand, where you had to do what was expected of you in order to be safe.
Oh
And
yeah.
I'm just glad we're talking to this point of the conversation, because I do believe, and this is where I could even take some heat from other more progressive advocates, that people
Mhm.
do change. People can
Oh
evolve
yeah.
the versions of themselves. Because I was there too. I was in a similar situation to you, where at a certain point, even though I had come out to myself,
Mm-hmm.
I would have said things like, oh, people have the right to change their orientation if it helps them live their version of religion that they want to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I was still holding those beliefs as late as graduate school in the early 2000s. So I get it, Paul.
Yeah, totally. And so, like, when you get to that sort of early 2000s and stuff, you got to remember as well, there wasn't the same access to information.
Right.
And the other thing was that for me, being able to access information, even when you did, like I had to have a narrative about it. So I was a youth leader for a long time. So,
Mhm.
like, if I even thought, oh, I'll buy a book that maybe talks about this a bit, it was like, well, I have to be informed about these
Right.
topics.
Right.
And, not that I have any issues
Mhm.
with this, but, I need to. And so there always had to be a narrative which gave a degree of plausible deniability. But
Right.
there was also a sense of like, there was nothing I think at that point that I ever found that really talked to my lived experience.
Yeah.
And so I think that was difficult because I was clearly searching. And I think that's what led me to then the first really I heard a guy talk at an event, and uh, he spoke of the work of Joe Nicolosi. And so Joe Nicolosi had talked about the non-gay homosexual,
Right.
so somebody who didn't want to live openly within a LGBT community, but who was attracted to the same sex. And so that was the closest that I found, I think, initially into trying to see, well, is that part of my story, or does that in some way inform me about how I can begin to look at things?
Mhm.
And that was still in the context of having a very clear sense of God's love, and not really. I found it increasingly difficult to see that God could be the God that I knew. It just didn't make sense to me that that same divine revelation could be, rejecting
Mhm.
of His creation, and wanting to condemn anybody or me to hell. But I wrestled with that because
Sure.
that was still a message,
Mhm.
if that was you, you were going to hell, and so that was really wrestling with that, with very little material, and really not a lot of people to go to
Right.
talk to about that. And there
Right.
certainly wasn't, there was a growth in the knowledge around, and eventually I was to find people like Joe Court,
Mhm.
and Joe's work was very important to me.
Mhm.
And talking about the degree of flexibility,
Right.
and like I was to come to see, like, even within LGBTQ to AA plus, the range of
Right.
expression, that in a sense there was still controversy within the community, looking at, well, are bisexuals a real thing? Because
Right.
I always felt an attraction to both genders, and so there was, and I guess that speaks to like my liminality. That in a sense, within medicine, I was drawn to psychiatry.
Mhm.
Within psychiatry, I was drawn to old age psychiatry, and
Mhm.
then to EMDR, which was this weird American thing.
Mhm.
Like I've always been quite liminal within EMDR. A conversation with Jim Knipe and Francine Shapiro around my work with schizophrenia led to that. And because I think ultimately there's always been a part of me which is, I can read things and hear things, but there's a big part of me reflects on my lived experience, and certain things that don't feel authentic or don't feel in integrity. And I think my experience of the divine has always been super important to me. And so, like, that's led me to the work of Brian McLaren. I mean, I can't remember when I discovered his work, but he wrote a wonderful book called A Generous Orthodoxy. And within the book, he talks about the journey of faith, and it really summarized it for me. And it's starting from a place of simplicity, which is what we've been talking about, that we both recognize, of simplicity. You're in, you're out, you're sinful, you're good, you're redeemed, you're one of the great unwashed, and you're not.
Right.
And then as I looked at it, it was like it just didn't fit. And so like I moved from working in like a very well-to-do area of youth group to what was then the largest estate in Europe, with young people who were dealing with paramilitarism and drug use. And I remember like we were talking about issues that come up for you as a leader. And I said, well, you'll not beat this one. They're like, oh, well, what was it? And I said, well, one of the older boys came to me and said, I have a question. I said, sure, you ask me anything. And his question was about being in an affair with an older married woman. I was like, well, I wasn't expecting that to
Right.
come up as a question, but this is the environment they were growing up in. And so I think, it always then challenged me about, well, where is God's love in that? Where is
Right.
God's love in if people if you're really stuck on like whether women should be wearing hats to church on Sunday or not, like that's not.
Yeah.
I just don't think that's the sort of God that I knew. And so the lived experience of that invited me to then start to look a bit more deeply at all of those issues. So simplicity became complexity,
Right.
but McLaren talks about complexity and moves very quickly to perplexity. And it did, it put me in a bit of a spin. And at that stage, I guess at that stage, then I had spoken to someone who I was then to experience a betrayal of trust with them. That I'd gone to somebody I thought that I knew they were closeted, but I thought that they might be able to help me to answer or understand the question, how do I work through this in terms of what I believe my faith identity is,
Right.
and within the context that I was journeying. And but sadly, they were just to use that as an opportunity for their own gratification, and that led me to a lot of problems. So that it was coming out of that and talking to that with my loved ones that then led me into trying to sort of do something with a more healing. It was the first disclosure I'd made. I talked about my sexual abuse. I talked about my struggle with attraction to the same gender, in addition to attraction to the opposite gender. But I think what I realized now was moving into those areas, which in some ways I've met some amazing people and I've experienced some really deep healing with them. But I think the sadness was that all too quickly, me as a person trying to find healing and understanding was forgotten, and I just became a credential. So I
Right.
became the psychiatrist who brought
S-
authority to what these different organizations were doing.
So let's talk about that. I know that's a difficult part of this story. Yet, how do you feel you were used as like that credential
Yeah,
by
well, I mean,
the ex-gay, the sexual orientation change movements and what that
yeah,
did?
I mean, it's interesting because obviously I was still entirely closeted and not talking about my
Right.
own sex identity at all because it didn't feel safe.
Yeah,
It wouldn't have been safe.
get
And
that.
like I was in a situation where I saw people who, how they were treated.
Hmm.
And, in a sense, I didn't want to be the target. And
Right.
also I didn't want to be targeted by both sides,
Right.
ending up
I
on
get that.
some sort of in between.
Mhm.
So I was very conscious of that and trying to maintain my safety and trying to, just be, just being at the stage I was in my life and trying to sort of balance work and family and profession and all of those things. But yeah, very quickly, I think, I am pretty articulate. I've been a teacher and a trainer and
Sure.
for years, for decades. But I think as I look back on it now, people very quickly moved away from Paul as the person trying to understand Paul,
Hmm.
and I became the person with the credential and that I could talk. And in these sorts of evangelical type of context, not only evangelical, again within all the different traditions or even religions,
Hmm.
there's a part where it's sort of like there's a recognition and certainly within the Northern Irish evangelical tradition, there's almost a bit of like, if people start punishing you, or if there is hardship that comes along from you
Right.
speaking up,
Hmm.
that sort of equates to how righteous you are.
Hmm.
And there's like, in a strange way, there's a validation. So I think it spoke in some ways to my need to be of value
Hmm.
and my need to be seen.
Right.
But I was really deeply conflicted around that too. And so I think that, part of it was whenever I started to do some of these mythopoetic experiential weekends and stuff, there was a part of that of meeting other people who were like me, who
Yeah.
were struggling as I was struggling.
Hmm.
And so there was a very strong dynamic of belonging, which was also present. But again, I think the systems for me, I think if I was to say anything to them, was, you sort of forgot about me in that, as a person making a journey.
Hmm.
And and so that, yeah, that was very
Yeah.
painful. And I think so whenever things started to become very public, then it was very difficult to know how to articulate that. Well, it wasn't safe, something that I considered the most private and personal things that I never, ever, ever wanted to see the light of day, um, was published on the front page of a national paper on Sunday. And so, there were things like that that were really difficult. And I think because people didn't know my journey or how I was, wouldn't have known what to say, how I identified really in a truthful way. But there was a sense of that of, I think the LGBT community probably saw me as, a white male straight doctor who was telling them they were broken and how to fix them. I mean, ironically, that was never me.
Right. I get that.
But equally, I didn't feel then safe in that environment to say, well, like, let me explain where I'm coming from.
Right.
And actually, with what I experienced, the message I was given, and also then part of it became about then protecting my license to practice,
Mhm.
and just my own sort of ability to support my family. And so there was a part of it then just became, go with the legal advice, say the bare minimum, and publish something that's been highly sort of,
Mhm.
uh, what would be the word, sterilized by
Mhm.
the legal people to say that's okay and that's safe for you to say. And like, people would have said, oh, why isn't he coming on the radio to talk to us now? Or I was like,
Mhm.
well, why would I? I
Mhm.
was, not only for me, I was not, did not feel safe, but also had to take into consideration my family as well.
Sure.
And I just thought, like, nobody really wants to hear their parents talk about their sex life
Right.
on radio.
Right.
And I certainly didn't want to do that. And I just didn't think it was appropriate. And so for a long time, I just sort of battened down the hatches and stuff. And I think that's why people like you then get asked the questions about me, because
Mhm.
there are correctives that are out there, but like,
Right.
the negative stuff is front page news. The
Hmm.
corrective is in page 56 somewhere,
Right. As a footnote.
font size 2,
Exactly.
it's like, good luck finding it. Um, uh, and I think that sort of was the way that we decided that it was just best to sort of stay with that. And I made a choice then, as stuff came up, as I did with you and as I've done with other people. If I felt somebody was approaching me in a genuine and an authentic way,
Hmm.
I'd offer them a one-to-one conversation, and I'd explain some of the stuff we were talking about. And they would say, all right, okay, so the Paul that I'm meeting now in conversation is the Paul that I met.
Hmm.
Whereas this other information that was suddenly given to me was like, who is this? Because it wasn't consonant with what their
Hmm.
experience of me had been. And so I did. It was interesting because I felt, because with EMDR and looking at the trauma model and understanding the degree of trauma that can come from this sort of stuff. Like, I think, to be honest, I think I said this to you before, it's, I think, only really recently, relatively recently, I mean, within the past few years, that I've really come to understand the, the sort of the how damaging it is to talk about how attraction is in any way a pathology.
Right.
And I think I can understand from the Joe Court's work helped me to understand that there can be out of control sexual behaviors which can be
Sure.
driven by experiences that are
Absolutely.
pathological and
Mhm.
traumatic. And I get that, I understand that. And I think what would I want to reassure people of when I talk to them? Well, the first thing is, look, get to know me and
Mhm.
understand where I am coming from. And so, because I didn't really feel safe doing that here, I was very pleased to then meet people. And one of the guys I met was Jess Converse. And Jess, again, after a few sessions of supervision, had discovered this stuff, or somebody pointed it out to him. And so he asked the difficult questions. And so we had a conversation about it. And it was great because within that context, we were able to then do some work together when he was working with down and out LGBT youth in Skid Row in LA. And that was good. It felt good to be able to do that work, a very liminal population. And
Because
Jess is
you
just,
presented together at EMDRIA, correct?
we did. We presented a poster in Hendra. Yeah,
Beautiful.
that's
Yeah.
right. And then the year or a couple of years after them, with that supervision group, we presented around LGBT work as well.
So
Uh-huh.
here's my big hard question for you that I think I'm asking on behalf of, not like I'm a spokesperson for the whole LGBTQ plus community, but I know whenever these discussions come up in EMDR spaces,
Mhm.
this would be the question that I think people would want to hear from you, your answer to. What would you say? Because we know there are still EMDR therapists out there,
Mhm.
even though EMDRIA has their SOCI policy in place, which I applaud them for, meaning that EMDR cannot and should not be used for sexual orientation, gender change efforts. But we know there are still EMDR therapists out there, usually citing their faith,
Mhm.
who say that, well, people have a right to change their sexual gender orientation, that this happens as a result of abuse, and EMDR is about us staying out of the way, so we should let them do that. We know these therapists exist.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
what would you, Paul Miller, who's gone through this journey and has learned all of this from the heart, say to them?
Well, I think I say this from because the last step that Brian McLaren talks about is moving from perplexity to humility.
Lovely.
And I think, and then Derek Farrell would say then also to a place of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first thing is that there's lots of stuff here that, for me, the thing I loved about EMDR is EMDR, the word Francine used, I remember, was that it's ecological. And based on that, I always say EMDR will never make a true thing false or a false thing true.
Yeah. Amen.
Uh, And I do believe that. I do believe that if we're truly authentic, but I do believe that. And I think that whenever we start to say that the trauma model, which is AIP, that in some way attraction is in some way a disorder of that, then we're really saying that there's something there which makes a person. Well, you're really going from the model, which is, I think, a moralistic model, um, that is reflected by certain scriptures, certain versions of scriptures. And I think that's, from my position, I think we have to be very clear that if you're making a moral judgment on what you believe is as a scriptural or religious position from whatever faith tradition you're from, at least be honest about that.
Mm.
And I think that what I experienced was people wanting me as a psychiatrist and wanting mental health professionals to say that being attracted to the same gender, um, that was a pathology. And I think it's very damaging. To be honest, that it's still something I wrestle with in my own lived experience. And so I see that, for me, I now am happy to identify as a pansexual man. I don't really like labels at all, to be
I get
honest.
that. Yeah. I can
I
appreciate
don't
that.
like them. But if I had to pick a label, that's probably the closest, because for me, it's about intimacy, and it's about the that really profound, deep connection with another person, body, mind, and spirit. And I think so. I think whenever people are looking at things, I think therapists need to be very careful not to be labeling something as a mental health thing or a biological thing or epigenetic or whatever thing they try to do to make their moral position credible.
Right.
And I think because they're two different things, be honest about it. If you believe really from a moral point of view that it's in your tradition or whatever sinful or something like that, well then talk about it in that context. Don't bring it in and seek to medicalize it and say that it represents a pathology,
Yeah.
because I think that's really damaging. And so, the other part of my journey and our journey as a family was my son Joshua is queer, and so like we love our kids, and we just didn't want him to experience what I experienced or we experienced as a family, and so it was important for him. We had to engage with the stuff that was out there about me, and we had to engage with the kids in a very personal way. And so Josh knows that he's loved and accepted, and we don't see his orientation such as it chooses to be identified at the minute. And who knows if that will be whatever. But
Mhm.
but that none of that was a pathology, and that it was just exactly as God created him. And so I think that's important. That was important, because I think they're very different things, and I think we have to be careful. There are Whenever we do anything, one of the places where I found a lot of healing was from the Mankind Project, and I know it has its critics, but one of the beautiful things about it was it took a really clear position on diversity, quite early on. And so I was able, as a result of that, to meet people first of all who challenged me about my position. Would I be a safe person to be there as a leader? And that was helpful, because it made me think. And but one of the things that they would say is that actions have consequences, intended and unintended. And I remember one time reading a book about parenthood, and by Steve Biddulph, Raising Boys, and in it he says, like, there come a point in your life where you realize that you were watching your father grow up at the same time. And I think that's the thing, that I'm not seeking to rewrite the past. Did I make poor choices? Yeah, of course. Um, but if you talk about, the person, there's a version of me out there which I don't recognize, and and I find peace with that. Like I've reached a place now in my life where I can say, and this is hard fought, but where I can say I truly and completely love and accept myself, and I do, and that's not dependent on anybody else, right? And that was hard fought, and so to be honest, it's a bit like we were taught one time during there was like a Christian thing at university of how to talk about your faith. And I've always remembered this because it just really stood out to me. And so the question would be, do you believe in God? And the person would probably say, no, I don't believe in God. And the follow up could be, well, you tell me about the sort of God you don't believe in, and I'll tell you about the sort of God I do believe in. And so for me, my journey of faith around that has been broad and deep. And when I went through my dark night of the soul, it was a bunch of Jewish guys when I was doing some work with the Orthodox Jewish community in London. They were the guys that helped me to connect to God again at a deeper level, and then looking at the Christian mystics, and so all of that was very much a sense of bringing me to a place of the experiential. So I began to then explore my experiential. And so my experience of then people who were LGBT were, some of the most lovely, warm people. And so there were things that just didn't fit for me, where like in Northern Ireland, when there was the debates and stuff around, gay couples being able to foster or adopt and stuff. And, the religious would be outraged about that. And I was like, well, most of the people that I'm treating who've been abused have been abused within heterosexual environments, not within gay environments. It just was nuts. It never made sense. And what just because if somebody was straight would make them safe and unsafe if they were gay, it just made no sense to me. But I think it was during that period then I really felt that I was without a voice, but I also chose not to speak because it felt like as soon as I would put my head above the parapet, people just shoot at me.
Hmm.
And I think I was very conscious of if I started to say even some of the things I've said today with you, Jamie, that the Christian community would then become my assailants.
Hmm.
So, like for some people, I would be too gay, and for other people, I wouldn't be
Sure.
gay enough. And
Well,
so I just didn't
I
want
get
that.
that.
I couldn't cope with it, to be honest. I just
Hmm. So, if I may, how are you feeling now, having said the things we've said today and have talked about today?
the conversation with you feels safe. I mean, I can't say that I'm not without anxiety in a sense. I mean, I think people will treat this whatever way they want to treat it, you know.
Thank you. Yes.
And I think they'll see me through the lens of their lived experience, and that's but that's not my work to do. You know,
It's not your problem. It's
not
not
my
my
problem. And
problem either.
I don't mean that in an unkind way, but it's not.
Exactly. Yes.
It's not. And my love and acceptance of myself, to be honest, I live in a place where I am really blessed with people who love and accept me, and people who know me. And when I hear people talking about what they believe me to be,
Hmm.
then I don't like that person either. I
Yeah,
wouldn't want to spend time with them, you know.
I
But
do.
that's
I
not
relate.
me. I don't recognize
Hmm.
me in that.
Hmm.
I can acknowledge I've made, you know, in that process of growing up and maturing, I've not always got it right. And I think it's interesting. I was reading a book by uh, a local Irish poet, and one of the things that he talks about, he's a gay man himself, Pora Gatuma, and he talks about hearing people talk about this orthodox position on sexuality and stuff, and then realizing later that those people didn't even really hold to those values, but they were saying what they felt they needed to say to stay safe. And
Yes.
I don't know if I was one of those people that he heard maybe talking. Maybe I was. But I thought that I could see myself in that. The things that I said and did. I mean, if you'd asked me at the time, I would have said absolutely. I'm convinced of these things and stuff. But that's McLaren's journey, isn't it? Simplicity and perplexity, and being you know taking a position of certainty because at least I could have solid ground under my feet, even if it didn't really fit until I'd hold on to it until it didn't fit.
And
And I've
something, I'm sorry.
no, no, I was just going to say, and so I've accepted it. I've come through that, and looking back, it's very hard to look back over 20 years ago now. There are things that stand out for me because they were deeply painful, and like a lot of traumatic memories, they're not hard to recall. But I think there's a lot of the stuff that over the years, with the love of people around me, I have let go of, and so it's very difficult for me to totally remember stuff from then. So, and that's not where I don't want to live looking backwards. I want to live looking forwards, and so that's part of the reason I'm doing this, I guess, because I want to do. I guess I want to do what I want to do, like the stuff around the sexual orientation change endeavor and trying to bring legislation in and stuff. Um, I think that's right. The legislation has to be right, though.
Hmm.
But I think if people want to take a religious stand on this, then be authentic and say that that's what it is.
Hmm.
Don't seek to find some
Right.
biological answer to it, or
Right.
it's like we used to joke about. They talked all about evidence-based medicine was the thing that came in. One of my colleagues was a bit of a wit, and he used to say, yeah, some people practice eminence-based medicine.
Ooh,
Don't you know who I am? And this is what I think.
oh,
And and I think people do that sort of thing for lots of reasons. And I think that was a shadow side of me,
mhm.
that I could be seen and I was being held up by that community, but it was deeply inauthentic.
And I just want to say, as we wrap up, in solidarity with you, that a lot of people in the EMDR community see me as this very open, vulnerable, progressive person. And I am. It took some time to get there. I wasn't fully out as bisexual until
Yeah.
2015 because it was a safety thing growing up the way I
Yeah.
did and still having a very religious family.
Mhm.
And if you want the full story, you can read You Lied to Me About God, which is my memoir, and you'll meet several versions of me in there that you will despise, especially about activities I was involved with in the church. Yet at the time, that's what I felt was the right thing to do. And now I have the language to say to stay safe.
Yeah.
At the time, I thought I was just doing what was right, what was expected of me, because I didn't know a wider worldview.
No, no. And I think that's probably the thing that I would say, well, I've said to my kids and stuff too, like the breadth of knowledge that we had available to us, the sources of safe, reliable information that was affirming, it
Mm-hmm.
didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it existed, I had no access to
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think the best that I can say to people now is, if you're prepared to authentically connect with me, then do that and see if the person that you think I am is who I am. And I mean, I mean, some people might still have hold negative values about me now. I really understand I can't control that, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. It's not nice, but I can't. That's their journey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making mine, and so for me, I think the part that we wanted, as a family and stuff, was to be very clear that there were things that we wanted and hoped that our kids would never have to experience. And so the people that I love dearly, who are within the LGBT community, you know, they shouldn't be being exposed to these things. And so that's where hopefully the right legislation, which feels like it's a bit of a political football, but hopefully that it will come in and it will achieve that. And I think EMDR has a rule, but it'll never make a true thing false or a false thing true. And you try to bend it beyond that, and that's not pretty.
Well, I think that's a great place to formally wrap it up. Paul, can you tell folks where they could connect more with your work if they're interested?
Yeah, so if people are interested, you can connect with my work through our website, so Mirabilis Health, so Mirabilis health.co.uk. And that talks a bit about my other sort of passion, which is the psychedelic work and psychedelic healing. And we have a YouTube channel as well under the same name, where we've got some training. There's going to be some new content dropping there too. And then there's some published stuff about schizophrenia and such like, and wrote a book about that. And again, it's part of that is about the authentic connecting to the person.
Yes.
And again, labels don't really serve that population either.
Mhm. Taking a breath for you and with you. And I thank you for spending this time with me today, Paul.
Jamie, thanks very much. A pleasure as always.